Here, we'll get make sure. All right, awesome.
Great.
Well, Shannon, welcome to Brilliant Balance. It has been fun to meet you. We were catching up before this that it's taken a few like fits and starts here to actually get on an interview site live, but I am so happy to be talking to you today.
I'm so happy to be with you, Cheryl Ann. Thanks for having me.
You have an absolutely extraordinary story. I will admit, I sent your bio to my dad, who is an Army vet, and I was like, "You have to read this story of this person that I'm interviewing." And he was just delighted, as you might imagine. So you have just a really like extraordinary backstory, and I don't want to give too much of it away. We're going to kind of reveal it as we go, but I want to really start in maybe an unexpected place, which is how you grew up. Like, I want to hear what young Shannon was like, and were you always someone who sought out challenges and adventures, or like what were you like as a little kid?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I changed a lot over my childhood. I was initially fairly shy. I played the piano, but I did grow up in Alaska, and so I think that childhood in a wild place with
Yes.
parents who got us out of doors all the time, and we were willing to be uncomfortable, and we were made to be uncomfortable, and in the best of ways, I think really did help to shape the person that I would ultimately become. And I'm so grateful for growing up in a place that is it's really quite unique. And later on, as a teenager, I started to debate, and I was on the debate team, and I was the captain of the swim team, and the head of the literary magazine, and all of those things. So I think there was some pivot point around, the early teenage years that things started to shift for sure towards a little bit more adventure. But early
Yeah.
on, I've been told that recently, even by a friend, that I was quite shy.
So interesting. Like somewhere along the way, something unlocked. What do you think really shaped like your early sense of discipline? Were you a disciplined kid? Were you a rules follower?
Well, I was the first child, so yes,
Yes.
all of those things. I definitely had a strict upbringing as well. My
Mhm.
dad was loving but strict and had very high expectations for us, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I think kids kids need to have high expectations, and they want to grow into those high expectations. And that didn't mean that things were always easy or smooth sailing, and far from it. And in fact, we clashed quite a bit, but ultimately, I think that discipline came from my dad, and wanting to please as the first child, not always in the best ways that made everybody happy in my
Right.
family, but in the way that I knew that I wanted to succeed.
You know what's behind it? Like there's an intention behind it that's pure, but sometimes the way we express that when we're younger is a little misguided, you know?
It is, and the other piece I think is a really important pivot is my parents divorced when I was 12, and I
Mhm.
still, and I've now experienced several other significant traumas in my life. I think of that as the most significant trauma in my life. And I know that kids respond to those things in many different
Differently.
ways.
Mhm.
I think my response was to try to overachieve so that people would leave me alone. And
Ah.
that actually, at the end of the day, was probably a pretty big part of that pivot. And it could have gone many different ways, but that's the way it went for me.
So interesting. It's so interesting. I'm so like the psychology of how our childhoods affect us is just endlessly fascinating to me. And you look at how the story unfolds and all the pivots and points that will never
Absolutely.
grow old for me, that's for sure. So you
Yes.
were obviously academically talented. You went to Duke for undergrad.
Yes.
What drew you there? What made you decide?
Oh gosh. Well, this goes back to this growing teenage angst and wanting to get a long way away from home, honestly, because it was the late 80s and nobody that I had known had gone to Duke or to the South. I knew nothing about the South. I knew
Wow.
nothing about anything about sororities and fraternities and the Greek system and all of the pieces that go into a Southern
Basketball,
university.
maybe? Yeah.
Basketball. And, we actually had an Alaskan on the Duke basketball team, but no, I was a swimmer. I was a
Yeah,
swimmer, a runner,
was
a
not your
skier.
thing.
So it wasn't my thing. But I did grow to appreciate it. And I'm a huge fan of Coach K. So both of those things grew and developed over time. But really, I think I wanted to get a long way away from home. Was fortunate to have opportunities to go a lot of different places, and we did go on a college trip. And Duke was the place where people seemed friendly and welcoming on my half day visit. And so
Yes.
that's where I
Sort
ended
of
up.
checked all the boxes, most especially far away from home. Yeah.
Ex Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Interesting.
I didn't apply anywhere nearby. So
And what
that's
did you study?
I studied English literature and art history.
So wild, right? This is again with the pivots. It's like there's nothing about this story so far that is leading where I know it's going. So for the listeners, they're like, where are we going with this?
Yeah, and yet
Because,
I would say that English lit piece is my passion, right? Like it always has been my passion, but my story will go many different directions
It
for
sure
sure.
will. Because you made this decision to join the Army. So
Yes.
tell me about that decision.
Part of this was late 80s, early 90s. Alaska was economically really bumpy. I was the first child. We were not from a wealthy family. And I knew that I was already working three different jobs at college. And I knew that I wanted to see if something resonated with
Mhm.
ROTC because it was a college fair and they were all represented there. And I was like, this is a way to help pay for college.
Absolutely.
I would hate it because that was just not anything that had been on my radar at all. And then I signed up for Army because you could be a liberal arts major, and in both the Air Force and the Navy, you had to be an engineer, and I was not going to be an
Interesting.
engineer. So the Army got me for the English, which is not what you
Fascinating.
would expect. And
Nope.
I ended up loving it. I mean, it was a bunch of kids or college students that were a lot like I was. We had grown up in families that were, largely patriotic, that believed in service, that believed in, working really hard and had worked ever since we were young. And also didn't have the benefit of having somebody paying for our college tuition.
Right.
So it's
There's
kind
a
of a
scrappiness to the kind of archetype, right, of a kid who decides, okay, I'm going to do ROTC and get this education handled, and then, yep, I have
correct.
some service and Roger that. Like yeah, I
Yeah,
can
exactly.
hear it. And so that, of course, ROTC comes with a commitment, if the listener doesn't know this, to serve for 4 years, right, after graduation
It
as an
does.
officer.
4 years as an officer, unless you take my route, which was aviation. And then it's 6 years after you finish flight school and your transition. So it ended up for me being 8 years of active service time because of the aviation component and the additional training that was required. But when you're 21, you sign on the dotted line, you have absolutely no idea what
Right.
your 20s mean or what
I
that
mean, I
means.
don't know. Aviation probably just sounds cool at that point. It's like, well, that sounds like a cool gig to, if I'm
It
going to
does.
serve.
Alaska has the largest, I think, percentage of private aviation of, I believe, anywhere in the world, certainly anywhere in the country. And I had also been drilling with the National Guard as part of my scholarship for the last 2 years of college with an aviation unit. So there was some understanding that went into that. But certainly I had this appreciation that if I had service to do, which I was very excited and proud
To
to do,
do.
I wanted to do the most interesting thing that I
Of
could do.
course. Of course. And I get, again, that's where you're in a 21-year-old brain making those decisions. Like, what's the coolest way to execute this commitment that I have? And I think you found
Right.
one because, y'all, as Shannon's story unfolds here, you go on to be one of the first women to fly Apache helicopters. So we got to hear about this. This is no small thing, right? What is that like? Tell me about the first time that you sat in the cockpit of an Apache. What was going through your mind?
Oh, well, you start out in a simulator. They don't let you in the cockpit right away. And actually the Apache comes after a full year of flight school. So I had already been qualified to fly on the UH-1 Huey and the OH-58, which is essentially the Jet Ranger, the OH-58 observation helicopter. So I was qualified on both of those. I had just finished the officer basic course as well. So that was over a year of training. And then you apply for and are ideally accepted into an advanced aircraft qualification. And, the Apache had only opened up the year that I graduated from college. And I had been told by the state aviation officer that I would never fly an attack helicopter.
Wow.
That was just not an option for me. And I hadn't really considered it because it had been closed. But once it was opened up, and this is the combat exclusion clause was lifted in
Yeah.
1993 for aviation for women. And I talked to people who had flown, not just flown the aircraft, but flown that mission and flown with that with that cohort of pilots and crew chiefs. And the crew chiefs don't fly, but they support it. And it's very much a team that is part of that equation.
Okay.
It was definitely the thing that I wanted to do. It sounded like the hardest thing to do. It sounded like the most challenging. And then you sit in the cockpit for the first time, like you asked, and
Right.
it's a massive aircraft. It's 58 feet long. It's, 18 feet across. It's 12 feet high. There's two different 1,850 horsepower jet engines. It has three different weapon systems and three different sight
Wow.
systems you can see in any condition. And it's a pretty amazing feeling to do the work to be able to take that first flight and all of the subsequent flights as well. I don't think it never was anything other than exhilarating, a little bit scary, a little bit terrifying, a little bit really thrilling, honestly. It was an incredible machine to have an opportunity to deploy.
Yeah. And the moment in time, like just you said 90, given me the range of years that you were serving after college.
So I went to officer basic course in flight school in 1993, and I
93.
served until 2001.
Okay. So, like, you're during that time, I am sure that there are not just one, but many, many moments that tested you that you kind of had to dig deep mentally and physically and emotionally. Can you tell a story about one time or more, maybe that comes to mind when you really kind of learned to dig for resilience?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. There are
Mhm.
many in many different ways. And I would say the most important thing, and maybe one of the most interesting things, is that very few of them were in the cockpit. Like you train to
Mhm.
fly, you fly this machine. It doesn't care if you're male or female or black or white or Asian. It just is a machine that needs
Yeah.
to be flown and controlled well. And
Mhm.
they train you very well to do that. And when you do your work, you're very good at that. So
Mhm.
so that is rarely where I found that challenge that was the most multidimensional. I think
Well, there's
the
probably
most,
hyper focus too. In an environment like that, it's like everything else shuts down. I have this one thing to do here, which sometimes
yes,
is freeing. Like, the ability to shut out the rest of the things swirling.
yeah, absolutely. And then the bigger challenges are, of course, and this is true in any part of our life once we have lived long enough to recognize it, is always with the part of change that you're participating in, right? And somewhat inadvertently, again, 21 years old, you sign on the line. This sounds like it's going to be a great adventure and
Mhm.
opportunity to serve. And yet the very act of being present as one of the first women to fly the Apache was a massive change for the military.
Yeah.
And it was a massive change for the units that I was coming into. And there's a bell curve of people in any large institution, to include the military. I worked with some of the best people I will ever know in my life, and I worked with some of the worst.
Yeah.
And it's also a very insular environment. And so there's an opportunity for things to be really difficult and there not to
Mhm.
be a lot of outside support or resources. And I guess that's the general picture that I would paint. I walked into my very first unit when I was 23 years old, so I had just been trained. I had just cut all of my hair off really, really short
Oh,
because I was not going to let anybody have any excuses to say that
sure.
I couldn't be here. And I wasn't trying to be masculine, but I was specifically not trying to be feminine either because I didn't
Sure.
want to
And
be a
make it a
problem.
non-issue, right?
Make it a non-issue.
Mhm.
And I remember I worked out really hard. I have always been an athlete, and I made sure that I maxed every PT test, which means you did the best that you could do on that
Yes.
physical fitness test. And I remember there was at one point, the feedback to that was, oh, well, all she cares about is PT. She doesn't really care about anything else. And I was like, wow,
Oh,
you can't even,
the backhanded, yeah.
you can't win for winning, right? You have to
Right.
be better than anybody else around you. And yet, even so, there are going to be challenges. And I can think of these small things that at this point in my life now sound somewhat small. It's very different when you're 23 years old.
23, sure.
Right. And you walk in and there's a nudie calendar up in the safety office. And I would try to make a joke because I didn't really know how to address my
Sure.
discomfort or the discomfort of, hey, that's not really supposed to be there anymore. I know it used to
Sure.
be, but now it's not. And I would make a joke about, the house decorations or something like that. And
Mhm.
and and that would always end up coming back and kind of biting you in some sort of a way.
Mhm.
And part of that is my naivete as well, right? And being very young in this new environment. But it definitely made it's what we now call the double crucible. It's why when I wrote
Yes.
Factor, I interviewed these other leaders in the vanguards of their fields because you both are doing this incredibly challenging work within your field, but you're also working in an environment which is either not comfortable to having you there or sometimes is outright hostile. And so
Right.
that's that double crucible, and that's a term coined by Deborah Road at Stanford for that double challenge that anybody faces when you're first coming into
First.
the environment, right?
Yeah.
And
It is so clear that, we are of similar age and that era of history, right? Where we're in the early 90s and everyone is trying to like act like we can do absolutely anything we want to do. We can be anything we want to be. We're seeing regulations and restrictions lifted akin to what you described in the military and combat. and
Yes.
everywhere else, right? We're kind of like breaking through all these barriers. And yet it wasn't like that made it easy. Like just because it was permissible or sanctioned did not in any way kind of ready the culture, right, to
Yeah.
accept those firsts and near firsts in all the different fields. So I think that it's a alchemy that bred grit. It just, we're going to go on to talk about your work around the idea of grit, but I think that
Right.
living in that particular era,
Yes.
as a woman, in your case, with a lot of talent, a lot of aptitude, a lot of skill, a lot of determination, but then to still kind of be like, to hear you say the hardest thing was actually dealing with the cultural implications of the people around me. And I think you're right. It always is. It's not the work. We're qualified to do the work. It's kind of what it
Right.
feels like to do the work. Yeah.
And some in some cases there are very specific things that will come up and be present that are pretty openly in opposition to moving forward.
Yeah.
And that is just one of those things where I think there is a all through school and even the schoolhouse at Fort Rucker, Alabama, right? All of those school environments are generally quite supportive in my experience, at least,
Hmm.
even if you are one of the only and usually you're not quite as much of a minority in a schoolhouse environment. But then when you get out to where the real world is, it's quite different. And I've talked to, women's business groups where it's a group of young women, at my alma mater business school who have all gone from college into a consulting role and now they're at business school and they'll say something like, I don't really understand why we need to have these meetings. It's really all the same. And I'm just thinking you've only been in that one environment, but
Hmm.
as soon as you get operational, everything changes. And I think that's really important to understand, both for the person who is approaching that so that you can properly prepare and buttress and have the resources you need to succeed, but also for those people who are leading within those organizations
That's
to understand
right.
how different that
That's
is.
right. And this is something that I sometimes get into debates about because my work, and the listeners will know this, is really very focused on the individual. Like most of my
Yes.
work is around equipping the individual to thrive kind of no matter what the environment around them is like. And of
Yes.
course, there is need for people who their passion and their place they're going to do their life's work is in institutional change. And how are we going to
Yes.
create environments that are, in fact, more welcoming, that
Yes.
honor kind of the full 360 view of the person. But I think you got to kind of choose where are you going to do your work. I'm choosing to do my work for the individuals. I am celebrate and I'm delighted that there's people doing work that are,
Yes.
focusing on the culture because it's a both and that's ultimately going to get us there.
It has to be a both and I'm so
Mhm.
glad you brought that up. I also feel like when I wrote the Grit Factor, I wrote it with that young leader in mind. So
Yes.
that was my avatar, right? So that is individual work. And yet I would also suggest that every single point along the way, every piece of it that builds this grit triad is something that you can then take into a culture, not just as a leader helping others in their individual work, which is step one, but in step two is you can apply these same frameworks to organizations, truly. And it's
Yeah.
not that different. There are different tactics and techniques that you'll put in place, but the concepts and the construct of that framework is very similar. So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
you're giving me a great transition to talk about grit and your work with the Grit Institute and their authorship of the Grit Factor. But help me build a bridge to that. So, we have you in the military, you're actively serving, you're learning these lessons and still performing.
Yeah.
What was it that ultimately led to leaving the military and how does that bridge us to the work you do today?
Yeah, it's a long story, so I'll try to make it short on leaving the military. I think the easiest way to say it is that when I looked forward at what the opportunities were in the military, I didn't see anybody above me that I wanted to be or living in the way that I wanted to live. And specifically women, but actually men as well. And I remember at one point we were in Kuwait, and it was just an exercise there. It was not the war. And I remember they'd manifest you to fly out and then you would be canceled. And then they'd manifest you and then it would get canceled. And there was one time I was sitting out on the tarmac and I'm sitting on my duffel bag and it's 120 degrees or something like that. And I look to my left and there's a private sitting on his duffel bag. And I look to my right and there's a colonel sitting on his duffel bag. And I'm like, it never changes. Does
Nope,
it?
this is going to be the
It
same
doesn't
forever.
change. And it's not entirely fair. There are people who have very meaningful careers in the military and extend. For me, I wanted to be part of a community. I wanted to have a family, which I did not envision in the military, although there are people who have,
Who do?
especially I think in later years after I left. But it didn't feel like a place where I could contribute my best work. And
And
that's
I
really
just
what.
want to pause there for a second because, if we could insert corporation X,
Yes.
nonprofit Y into this
Yes.
story and have the same thing. But I think that that is a universal experience.
Yes.
I left a corporate career after 15 years to do entrepreneurial work. I think, and my answer could have been exactly the same. I looked
Yes.
up and said, not only do I not want those jobs, I don't see people living the life I want to live who are in those
Yes.
jobs. It's like there's this
Yes.
both and. And that is a crucible moment. I mean, that is one of those times when you're saying, everything that I have worked for, all of this effort that I've put in to climb this particular ladder, I'm
Right.
I'm saying it got me here. I have a lot of gratitude for what got me here, but now I'm going to have to like pack up my courage and go start a new chapter if I want to get the life I really want. And
Yes.
it's so brave, right? I mean, I felt that way when I did it. I don't think I realized how brave it was, and I see it in you of like walking away from something that certainly had upward potential for you, I'm sure.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
No, I knew that I would do well if I stayed in, but I
Mhm.
also felt like I was becoming somebody that wasn't who I really
Fully
was.
you.
And
Yeah.
it forced me to do well, I had to be somebody that wasn't who I was. And that was I couldn't have defined it exactly that way at that
Till
time.
later. Yeah.
But I also made that decision later from a corporate career as well, when you start to realize like there's something that doesn't fit about my purpose and my values. And not that there's anything wrong with what I'm doing, but it
Nope.
just isn't the right direction. And I come back again and again to this phrase that every one of us needs, and every person that works with us or for us needs, and our children need to be able to contribute their best selves in the world. And the world needs us to contribute our best selves. And so the key is the hope is the purpose is to find that purpose, right? That thing that
Mhm.
transcends ourself where we're able to make our absolute best contributions. And it will never be easy. It will usually come at a cost. And it is ultimately at the end, I hope, worth it.
I Amen. Yeah, I could not agree more. So you had a corporate bridge that then led to the Grit Institute. So briefly, tell us about the corporate chapter.
Yeah, yeah, very, very briefly. I spent 2 years at the Tuck School at Dartmouth. So I did
Mhm.
a full-time MBA program, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I now
Yes.
teach as part of the executive education faculty at that MBA program, which is also a complete joy. But then worked in the medical device industry and then ultimately at Microsoft. And so I had about 5 years or so just in the corporate space, working in business development, working in sales, leading teams, leading global efforts and change. And
Mhm.
it was a lot of fun. A lot of it was. I really found it, I mean, it was compelling, it was
It's a
challenging,
learning experience, sure.
great
Mhm.
learning experience. And I think the long story short is we had a family tragedy early in my time in Microsoft. I write about it in my first book, which is called North of Hope, which is only available a few places right now, unfortunately. But that I left Microsoft ultimately to write that book, and
Okay.
also because we were getting ready to start a family, and I was working hours that didn't support
Yeah.
that kind of focus in our family life. So it was a kind of a combination of those two factors. And the first book came out, I gave a present, it's a memoir, so it's a lot more personal than the Grit Factor is. But I gave a presentation to an online women's leadership group. And at the point that I gave that presentation, I don't even know what the platform was. It was pre-Zoom, you know? So I had no
Right.
idea on that call. And then New York Life reached out and said, hey, would you come to New York and present to us? And the long story made quite short is that that developed into what has now been well over 10 years of a public leadership speaking, keynote speaking career, in addition to developing executive education for companies and clients, in addition to teaching at the Tuck School, and then ultimately writing the Grit Factor, which really pulls together a lot of the ideas, the frameworks, brings in other people's experiences as well to come up with a cohesive framework for grit and resilience that looks at a person in a very holistic sort of a way.
Well, that's a lot, right? Let's unpack a few of those things. So some of this I did not know even in my research. So there's a memoir that gets published. You're doing speaking in an online environment, and essentially it sparks more interest in having you come and speak, which then
Yes,
leads to founding the Grit Institute. So you're starting to pull like your ideas, your body of work together into something cohesive, the book
yes.
and the institute. So the Grit Institute does consulting work with.
Primarily, so I don't do direct consulting typically, although I do end up having a few engagements that are more akin to that. But really, it's about working with a company to find a way to integrate the training around the
Principles.
factor, as well as going deep into purpose, because there's a lot of really interesting and super important work around purpose, which is the new direction of the Grit Institute as
Love
well, is
it.
building on grit and resilience into the purpose space specifically, because that is really what it turns out was at the root of
Of
this
grit.
massive upheaval during COVID, right? This
Yeah.
massive um, workplace upheaval, which is that people were not connected to their own personal purpose, so they couldn't connect that personal purpose to their workplace purpose. And
Mhm.
I started to dig into that research, dig into my own experience and others' experiences. And that has resulted in now a 6-week training course that we have implemented at multiple companies across the country and internationally. Have also implemented it at the Tuck School as part of their Next Step program, and also have actually a program for high school and college kids
I love
that is meant
that.
to be a facilitated program and really get more into communication and some of the emotional resilience as well.
That's amazing because I think I want to just talk about resilience and its relationship to grit for a second. It's like
Right?
it's something I'm fascinated by that I do think to have grit, you
Yes,
have to exhibit sort of um, sequential episodes of resilience, right? It's like you could almost define it as like resilience over and over and over again is what gives you grit. And that ability to stick with something, I also can immediately see the connection to purpose because it's so much easier to persevere in pursuit of something if you care deeply and feel deeply aligned.
yes,
Much harder to stick with something if you're like, I just don't care. Like, I don't care enough about this to have to go through the hard chapters of getting knocked down and back up again, right? So I think
totally.
about
Yeah.
my chapter as an entrepreneur when 15 years ago when I started Brilliant Balance and in an earlier permutation and all the twists and turns since then. I do think
Sure.
that's the thing that gets me up every day and kind of keeps picking me back up whenever something goes sideways is I
Yes.
believe so much in the value of what we're trying to do here, right? So can you have grit if you don't have purpose?
I think you may have episodes of grit
There you
for
go.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is much more difficult for that to be a sustainable sort of and I'm not going to say sustainable skill in the sense that it's something that you should sustain. I always say that grit is a really important capability, but it is not something that should be a sustainable operating mode, right? That's something that
Right.
you should draw on, that you should be able to employ, but not that you should have to be living every moment, because really, I think there's very few people who would be able to manage that.
That's what I
So,
call white knuckling it. Like if you're in a
yeah,
chapter where you're kind of white knuckling, you can do it for a while, but you can't live that
yes.
way. Yeah.
Can't live that way. And in some regards, grit can be, and I talk about it as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. But when I break out the grit triad, which are the different components of grit that really came out of the conversations with the many other leaders in the vanguards of their fields that are part of the grit factor, in
Hmm.
addition to my own, the foundation of that grit triad is called the commit phase. That commit phase is this deep internal work of owning your own story and connecting to your core purpose. That's foundational to grit and resilience. And it's the place that I recommend people return when things get really tough, when times are turbulent, when times are uncertain, when you're feeling like you can't get through because you don't know what's happening next. And there's this angst or this anxiousness. And there's a lot of that right now. And I say you've got to come back to that foundation, which is owning your story and connecting to purpose. And that is internal work before you get into the second leg, which is learn deep engagement in the present, and the third leg, which is launch, which is that groundedness in the past, that engagement in the present, and then looking towards the future. But that foundational piece you've got to return to again and again and again.
Hmm. So,
Yeah.
in this triad, when you think about owning your story and connecting to purpose, it's sort of like this is the rootedness. This is how you stay grounded. This is the thing you
Yes.
come back to. And then you
Yes.
went into the second, which was learn, and it was deep engagement in the present.
Isn't. Yes, exactly. That's about building your team. So building the support structure that you need to succeed, understanding that none of us do this alone. So that's the first piece. The second part of that is if you are in a leadership position or you have a family, it's about supporting your team as well. So it's both and, because taking care of your people is the most important job as a leader.
Mhm.
The second part of that is the art and the science of active listening, which is fascinating that came out as the most important strategic leadership skill in all of the conversations I had with general officers and admirals across the services, right? It's that active listening that allows you to both lead yourself and others. And it's very hard, but it can be cultivated. Anyone can cultivate it. But it's very hard if you're an execution oriented person to really
Yeah, you want to move to fixing instead of understanding. Yeah.
absolutely Always we do, right? And then finally, it's the mindset of grit and resilience, and that is growth mindset as well as stress mindset. And it's also most importantly, and I think of this as so important that it's a circle that surrounds the grit triad, is the mindset of grounded optimism. And that is the Stockdale paradox. I tell his story in the book. It's ultimately never, ever losing faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end, balanced with the brutal realities that you face in the present. And that must be present in order to be able to live with grit and resilience.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I love that grounded optimism surrounds the entire thing. Like, I think for the people listening to, like, just ask yourself that. Think about any situation where you've been able to personally exhibit grit, right? This kind of dogged determination in the face of something. What was the
Difficult
word?
circumstances.
Okay.
Yep.
So when you think about that, if you're able to stay in it, you do it's this duality of holding the tension between I believe this will work out and it
Yes.
sucks right now. You
Yes.
know,
Absolutely.
that's kind of the without it, if you lose that grounded optimism, you give up, right?
Yeah.
This is where people bail, they
Yes.
quit, they just shut down, like they lose their ability to sustain the forward momentum. And I think
Absolutely.
if you're overly optimistic, like it's not grounded optimism, it's kind of
Yes. Poly.
Pollyanna optimism, you know,
Exactly. That's right.
then you can't tolerate the dissonance between the reality of it currently sucks. So there's
Yes.
something about that that like tethers the two ideas
Yes.
together. Yeah, I
It's
really
so
love that.
important because it really is this, it is a dance a bit, and
Mhm.
really the strength of it comes from experience, but it also comes from the decision. And I think the most exciting thing about mindset is that it is always a decision that each one of us makes. We have
Over
complete
and over again. Yes.
agency, right? But
Yes.
it's our decision that we have to
Yes.
remind ourselves, I get the choice in this moment to decide. That
But
doesn't
it's
mean it's
very Viktor Frankl. Like, right?
it is, absolutely.
That's the
Yes.
one thing we probably always have control over is
Exactly.
that what we do with that little space between stimulus and response.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
I'm curious about I really thought it was important, and I had a question written down for you about so many of the women who listen to this are very high achieving. They're like they'll
Yes.
take the hill, run through the wall, like whatever has to happen. But they also hit those moments of exhaustion or self-doubt or, like when you're in a marathon, um,
Yes.
how do you keep grit sustainable in a way that doesn't become relentless? Like where is that edge?
I'm so glad that you asked that. One of the, if I were to go back and write the grit factor today, and this came out during COVID, so it was such an interesting, somewhat unfortunate time, but also perfect because
Mm-hmm.
at the time and we need it today. But the piece that I would have included that I did not is that grit is not a sustainable operating mode. And if you are in that place, that sustained stress, stress can be a performance enhancer, but not if it's continuous. And so making sure that you build into your day, into your week, and into your year periods of rest is critical. I mean, it's critical for your ability to perform at the highest levels. And I think so many of us push through for so long that we get to the point of near collapse or actual collapse or just not being able to keep going,
Breakdown. Yeah.
right? And
You
that's
you
that
hear from a
doesn't,
lot of people who say, I can't. I'm sure you hear the same thing I do in this.
yeah,
Like, oh, you just don't understand. I just can't. I can't. Like, this
yes,
is an issue with a child. This is a company
yes,
that's mine. This is, there's
yeah,
lots of times where people will tell you, I just can't have. What do you say
yes.
to them?
I understand, and I have been there as well, and I am often still there. And I would challenge myself, and I would challenge each of those people to redefine maybe what it is that they can or can't do. In the sense that it doesn't mean that you have to take,
A
have a
2 week
2 hour
vacation.
run in the middle of the work week. That's not what we're saying at all. But if you can take literally 10 minutes, and I promise you, you can do that. Even if you have an infant, you can leave an infant in a crib for 10 minutes. I promise you it will be okay. And once you've moved through that phase, you realize how over worried we
Yes.
were at the time,
Hmm.
right? And go for a walk or be in quiet or be in that place that is truly
For
rejuvenating
you.
for you. It's not going to fix everything immediately, but over time, I think that the science supports this as well, that will accrue, that will be a point of strength for you so that you can come back stronger. And I think that's the key. You're going to come back stronger when you give yourself a time to rest. You have to do it. It's a non-negotiable, and you need to make it a
I
non-negotiable.
think making it a non
Yeah.
negotiable is really the critical thing. We can tell ourselves stories about what will happen, how,
Yes.
and why we can't. And here's the tragic thing that will happen if I take my eye off this ball for 10 minutes, right? Or an hour or whatever. And
Yes.
often our imaginations are worse than the reality. I mean, I think that's been my experience for sure. I do
Yeah.
think I talk a lot with our audience about foundational practices and what
Yes.
is the collection, small collection of practices that keep you healthy, whole, and human.
Right.
We all know
Yes.
what they are. They're probably a little bit different for each of us, but there's some core principles, right? Sleep,
Yes.
um, like movement, time outside. Like there's things that I think actually time alone where no one needs anything from you is a foundational practice for most of us. And
Absolutely.
where you get that time and how much of it you can get and how compromised or fully expressed it is will vary through seasons.
Yes.
But
Yes.
coming back to that as like a kind of lifeline that just has to have some drumbeat of support, I think is true all the time. Like, no matter how extensive the crisis is that you might be in. And look, we have people navigating significant crisis listening to this today, I'm sure. We have people who are in kind of the middle, just like this is normal life. And we have people who are riding high and like they got all kinds of time for recovery. It
Right.
matters in all of those times. Right.
It
And
does.
the ability to come back with persistence and grit and some semblance of like access to your full brain is probably going to be a
Yes.
lot higher if you take those times. I'm so glad to hear you say that because honestly, Shannon, I think people could read your profile and think like this woman's going to be like a, you know, just pedal to the metal 100% of the time. And I have found you today to be very balanced in your perspective, and it's really like hard earned wisdom that you've lived out in. It sounds like a lot of different chapters of life.
It definitely is hard earned, and you know that very well also from your experience, and I'm sure most of your listeners do. But it is important, and I think if I could do something different looking back, and I think probably most of us would maybe say this, I would love to have had some of this wisdom earlier, and yet some of the wisdom came because of that experience
That's
as
right.
well. So
That's right. We have to do it wrong sometimes to know what right looks like. Like you have to have the contrast to really see it. And I
yes,
think for so many of us who listen to this podcast in particular, are parents. And when we think about the lessons we want to impart to our children, I
yes.
grew up probably much like you, very high standards and expectations. I pushed myself really hard. I achieved a lot because of that. And I have found that I've really almost overcorrected that within my own children because I recognize that like that wasn't the answer, right? The answer
Mhm.
wasn't push, push, push at all costs. What you
Yes.
mentioned that you're doing some work that's with young people. What is the kind of needle you're threading around that messaging with them?
Gosh, I mean, it's so complicated in the world with young people and young adults right now. I have two children myself who are 12 and 15, so they're kind of in the right in the
In
midst
the
of
thick
this.
of it. Yep.
They're in the thick of it. And as I talk to other schools, and we're actually in the middle of developing a school in our community as
Mhm.
well, which is all kinds of challenge in and of itself. It is a balance of all. I guess in the midst of all of the noise that we're hearing, there's
Mhm.
so much noise around education and around the psychology of kids, and I think for me a lot of it has come back to like listen to yourself, because I think for most of us, if you were paying attention, cell phones were never a good idea for kids, right? So go back to that innate wisdom for yourself that you might not have listened to early on, and give it more credit than you did. Be careful about the things that come out as these flashes in the pan, because there are industrial complexes around every single thing that exists in our society, which
Mhm.
includes education. So if there's a flash in the pan, it's going to be the most important thing. It's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to change everything. But at the end of the day, kids need to read. They need to read real books. They need to write, and they need to write by hand. They need to not be on screens very much. They need to be outside. They need to be moving their bodies. And those are all of those things that are basic to health and thriving for a child, in addition to having adults outside of their family who are really invested in them, right? And I think there is a lot of work around having this one adult at least. And that
Mhm.
is often found in a faith community if you happen to be part of something like that, or there may be another activity that you're part of where that
A
can be
coach or
particularly
something.
useful.
Mhm.
But yeah, exactly, a coach or a
Mhm.
teacher could also be part of that. So we're working in all of those dimensions, looking at some of the challenges that kids are facing in terms of communication, again, because of screens in many cases,
Yeah.
and because of some of the challenges challenges they're facing with mental illness. And so the Grit Factor 6-week program for high school and for college students that is meant to be facilitated. It's designed for even a low skill facilitator to manage. And they will be looking at the books, The Grit Factor, but it's really grounded in communication in small groups, on one-to-one, and in the larger group, so that we're building those skills and that capacity. At the end of the day, like relationship with each other is critical to our grit, our
Resilience.
resilience, and our thriving and our satisfaction in life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree. My kids are 14, 17, and 20, and I think we're living in that same sort of era of everybody rushed in with
Yes.
technology because we thought we had to. And then when you look at like if you could go back and do it differently, what would you do differently? So many things, so very many things. But one of
Yeah.
the pieces of collateral damage I don't think we saw coming was the impact on interpersonal relationships and communication,
Yes. That's
and
right.
their inability to, and I think also deep work, deep
Yes.
reflection,
Yes.
pondering is just it's hard to be sort of self-examining when it's so easy to numb out with like constant stimulation. So for us
Yes.
too, for adults as well,
Yeah.
but certainly for our kids with their formative brains, it's I
Yeah.
like that you have a kind of counter approach that you're surfacing. I think so
Well,
many people say like, well, what can I do? What can I do about it? Like this ship has sailed and you found something to do about it in a really meaningful way, which is great.
it has not sailed. It has never sailed. This is true in all aspects of our life, that it is never too late. It is harder the later that you start or the later that you intervene, but it has never sailed. And it is so important that
Yes.
you do whatever you can in the midst of that, whether it's for your kids, absolutely 100%. They only have one time to be a kid. It's never too late. And for our own lives and contribution, it is never too late. And I think that's an important reminder as well.
Amazing. Well, I am so glad that we had the opportunity to connect on this. This work is exceptional. I want to make sure everyone has access to the book, which is The Grit Factor, which we will link in the show notes, as well as to learn more about your work at the Grit Institute. Do you want to give us the URL verbally, just in case that's easier for them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just thegritinstitute.com. And I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again today for being here. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Cheryl Ann, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Yay. Amazing. I'm going to kill the recording.